Right, now, can you hear me? I can only hear one of me.
I can only hear one of you as well.
Okay, good. So
Yes.
we've got that. I don't know what happened there. So can everybody out there, if you're still around, do apologize. Can you confirm whether you can still hear one each of us, and are you still out there? I see Lee's put Tony's lost down the toilet. That's a typical comment from Lee. He's a devil. So hopefully, everyone, like I said, I don't know how or why that did that. So let's see whether some people turn back up again, because we've 20 minutes has gone. We even came on early to make sure that everything was good and the sound was perfect until we went live. So I don't know what happened there. Audio is okay now. Okay, great. Well, thank you for hanging around. So I just asked Chris, just very briefly, while we just give people a couple of seconds, how's your hand healing, and when do you hope to get out camping and walking again?
It's healing okay. It's slow, but I knew that would be the case. I'm hoping I'll get out for a longer day walk later this month. I think camping, because of how much you have to use your hands, and a heavier rucksack, will be next month, but certainly I hope to get out sometime next month.
Right, okay. All right, super. Well, long may that healing improve. And are you hoping to get the other hand done this year?
No.
That'd be next year.
Next summer, yeah.
Right, okay. All right. Well, what we're hoping to talk about, if we can get through it, is the subject of permits, which kind of came up the other week, and maybe water treatment, or what happens with water when you're out in the hills. So we'll start with the permits, and then we'll see how time goes. So, Chris, as I've mentioned a few things to you before we started, so I'll just start from the top, as it were. If a permit system was to be brought in, how would it be set up?
Well, actually, I don't see how it could be set up, except in a very few places. Now, I've been backpacking in places where you have to have a permit in the USA and Canada, but those are on land that is owned by the government, and you do not have, for camping, free access. You need a permit. But if we're talking about private land, which in the UK we generally are, it would, I think, be very difficult. Now, I should say, of course, I'm in Scotland, where we have a right of wild camping and access to wild land without a permit system needed. The only permit system that's been introduced, which is in Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park, but that is for car camping beside the loch. Now that's very different. Right. Car camping is not wild camping, even if you're not on an official campsite, but it's much easier, obviously, to say you can't camp by the roadside or near the roadside without a permit. But once you're talking about wild camping, I really don't see how a permit system could work. But one of the things is that permit systems require an awful lot of bureaucracy and rangers to enforce it. Again, in US national parks, you fill in a form, you have to go to the park office, collect your permit, you're given a talk about your responsibilities. There are lots of rangers out in the backcountry, there are ranger cabins, trails are patrolled regularly. You'd have to set all of that up, because just saying you need a permit, but no one's ever going to bother asking for it, and where do you get it from anyway, doesn't do anything. Also, as far as I can tell, the people so far who are suggesting permits are also suggesting paying for the permits, with the implication that it's a way for somebody to make money, which would be a different issue again. But I think the only way it could work in England would be for a landowner whose land is currently inaccessible, where there is no access rights to the land. Now, that landowner could say, I'm going to allow a limited number of people in, and they can camp in these limited spots.
Right.
And I will control that by, you have to buy a permit. But, if 10 people buy a permit to go and camp in this spot, then the gates will be open. They can come in, they can walk to that spot and camp and walk out again.
Yeah.
That's the only way I can see it working. In areas where there is already open access, like, say, the Lake District or Snowdonia, and where you've got innumerable landowners, I can't see how a permit system could operate.
Right. So because each landowner presumably might want different requirements and different things like that, so it would make that more difficult.
Yeah, and it can be hard enough to find out who owns exactly what and where the boundaries are, But also you'd have the fact of which one of the proposals I saw for permits that I thought was crazy seemed to suggest that it would be a permit to walk in and camp somewhere. Well, there might be other people camping anyway, but they hadn't got a permit, so they hadn't got the little map showing them how to get there. That isn't going to work.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I'm not in favour of permits.
No.
In principle, anyway. But when it works in the US and Canada, you're talking about huge areas owned by the government, and the stricter permits are only in the ones that are really popular. In a lot of areas, yes, you get a permit to say you go in the backcountry, but you can then disappear for a month, and go where you like and camp where you like.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. I mean, certainly in England, we haven't got anywhere like that. I mean, even the Scottish Highlands, which is by far and away the biggest area of wildland in the UK, is tiny compared with wilderness areas, national parks in North America.
Yeah. So if something was set up then, because obviously to make clear to people listening, this isn't trying to say that we want permits. We certainly don't.
Definitely not.
And we don't agree with them, and we would never want one. This is just a sort of a conversation as to, the complications of and the daft idea of it, and trying to cover everything, just in case people are suddenly thinking, or these two are in favor. We're not. It's kind of, we just want to cover all bases. So we've kind of covered the complications a little bit in what you were saying there, and obviously it's various different landowners. So because people say it works in America, and because it works in one place, I think people are saying, well, then it should work here. But I think from what you're saying, the reason why it works there and wouldn't work here is because it's government owned there and private owned here. So the government, because it's government there, they could control what's going on within the government land. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, example would be if, say, the Lake District National Park was owned by the Westminster, was owned by the government. So the Lake District National Park Authority had complete control over the national park. They do everything. And when I say everything, when you're talking about US national parks, the rangers are also the police force. So you would have a national park where the rangers can arrest people. The rangers can tell people they will be fined if they don't move on.
Right.
But also where the park can say, we control all the ways into the park. To get into the park, you have to go past an entry point. And if you need a permit, if you're going into the backcountry, you have to go to the park office to get a permit, which if it's a popular area or place, they'll say, well, there's only so many permits per day. Come back tomorrow, we're full. Because you go to, say, Yosemite National Park, there's only a couple of places you can drive into the park.
Right.
So it's very easy that everyone going into the park gets a parking permit. You can't go into the park in a vehicle without doing so.
Right.
You imagine trying to do that for the Lake District or Snowdonia. Every single road into those national parks has a park office and a barrier, so that all roads going in are stopped and handed pieces of paper about their responsibility and so on, and and their car registration is recorded. Then they can go in. I mean, it's not going to work. But also with the ownership, as I say, you're talking about vast areas in North America. I don't know how many landowners there are in the Lake District, but it's a whole patchwork of landowners. I mean, I know, the National Trust is one of the bigger ones, but there's also, the Forestry Commission, there's private farmers, there's private landowners, there's a whole mishmash. You've got to get all of those together, and they've all got to agree on a scheme that they're all going to operate exactly the same way. Someone has got to pay for that scheme to be set up.
Right.
I mean, I say I'm not in favour of it anyway. I can't see any way it could be made to work.
No. And why do you think that when the subject came up, it was kind of directed at wild campers? Why do you think that? Obviously, we're against the idea, but you get where I'm trying to go. Why would only wild campers be targeted for this, and not just everybody who went in? Why would they be picking on a smaller proportion?
This is, I think, because of how an awful lot of people understand the term wild camping, by which they mean, and the media does this all the time, any camping that isn't on an official campsite that you pay to stay on. So someone who pulls into a lay-by, puts their tent up in the field next to the lay-by, is described as a wild camper. Well, that's not whatever real wild camping is. I mean, wild camping is an interesting term in itself, in that it's only really come into prominence in the last 10 years. For most of the time I have been backpacking, no one ever talked about wild camping.
Right.
They talked about backpacking, which in a way is a better term, because backpacking is carrying everything you need on your back to somewhere to camp. So the camping and the walking go together. Wild camping, what a lot of people mean who talk about permits, is the people, which is, I think, is still a minority, but far more than actual wild campers, who never go very far from the roadside, or certainly never very far from their vehicle, which they might get some distance from the roadside, and create a mess, whether it's leaving litter, cutting down trees, burning fire into whatever it is.
Yeah.
That does not come under the true definition, I think, of what wild camping should be.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the Scottish Access Code, which in terms of access rights talks about camping, and it says camping is small tents for 2 or 3 nights at most, away from roads, away from buildings, not in cultivated fields, and leave no trace. Now, they don't call it wild camping, but that, I think, is what wild camping should be. Yeah. And the roadside camping and the camping that causes problems is not wild camping. And also, even in Scotland, under the Access Code, these people do not have the rights they think they have, because they're breaking the code. They're breaking what is that, and the code is, we're talking about legal definitions here. This is an act of the Scottish Parliament that gives access rights and camping rights. It's not just an idea or an agreement.
Right.
It's a legal document.
Yeah. One question is interesting from Lee's just put in. Do you think wild camping is now so popular because I'm imagining he's thinking of coronavirus. So do you think that it's taken off since then?
I think it's part of the whole thing of people being unable to go abroad. So you stay in this country, what do you do? So I imagine, coronavirus, the epidemic was part of it. Also, I imagine that costs are part of it. It's part of the whole financial crisis. It's a lot cheaper to drive out into the countryside and put up a tent than it is, to go abroad or even to go and stay in a hotel somewhere. So I think that comes into it. Another is the last decade has seen huge growth in very, very, very cheap camping gear.
Right, yeah.
Which initially was for festivals. Well, it is, people going to big festivals, like Glastonbury and so on, camping there. It's the only time they were going to camp.
Yeah.
They weren't going to be buying expensive or even, moderately priced backpacking gear, which would be overkill for what they were doing anyway.
Right. Yeah.
But now the ridiculous, low priced camping gear means it's easy for someone to think, oh, we'll go camping. We can buy a whole camping kit for 50 quid and that'll do for the weekend. And if we abandon it, well, next time we'll just buy another one.
Right. Yeah. And do you think that the rise of social media, YouTube, Facebook groups, and things like that, do you think that's helped promote camping and people doing things?
Definitely, yes. Yeah. I mean, as with other activities, but you only have to, you look at, in particular, Instagram and all these camping shots where people have gone, found somewhere, put up a tent in order to get a picture of it to post on Instagram, which then encourages others to do the same. So it becomes, a thing in itself. So as I say, coronavirus, yes, but there's all these other factors as well.
Right. Yeah. So going back to permit, we kind of covered. So what would the drawbacks of a permit system be then? We can probably whack that one a little bit.
Well, it takes away the freedom of backpacking. It takes away the freedom of walking into whatever the wild area is, hills, coast, or whatever, and stopping and putting up your tent and camping when you want to. I mean, if you do call it wild camping, if you like, it takes the wild out of it. I mean, the places where I've been with permits, the ones that were very restrictive, where you had to stay on a backcountry campsite every night, I did find that really did, impinge on it. Luckily, as I say, even in North America, it's only a few areas. And some of the areas, I could understand it. In the Grand Canyon, there's not many flat areas where you can camp, and they're very small.
Right.
So I can understand there where it's like, well, we can't have a free-for-all because if 20 people turn up on this site in the middle of nowhere that's very hard to reach, and the next place where you can camp is 10 miles away and there's only room for 2 tents, what happens? So I can understand that there. But I say I never liked it, and I always preferred it on the long walks in North America when I got out of these areas and back into being able to camp where I wanted. Right, so I need a permit, but the permit basically said you have a permit to be in our national park or wilderness area for the next month.
Right. And when you camped on those spots, where you had to have, the permit and a specific place to camp on, did you find that was kind of like a campsite, or was it still a bit different to a campsite? It still sounds quite campsite-y like to me.
No, they were like they're very basic campsites. Some of them they varied. Some of them would have no facilities at all. All you got was you got there and there'd be a sign on a tree saying, you know, Blue Creek campground, and there'd be some bare ground.
Right.
That's it. And you're in the woods.
Yeah.
Others sometimes could have bare poles for hanging your food in bare country. Some occasionally you might get a picnic table and a bench. You'll often get a fire pit if it's in an area where fires are allowed, you know, and wood provided, so you don't start hacking down the trees.
Right.
So some of them become more like a basic campsite that you would pay for, and some of them it's just a spot where you're allowed to camp and there's a sign telling you there. So they vary. Yeah.
Right. And with the ramifications, if something like that was set up, I assume then that the money, obviously some would go to rangers or something like that, but presumably the landowners and such like would probably be wanting a cut of it as well.
I would imagine so. I wouldn't think they'd be happy for someone else to be making money out of their lands.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing that because I know I had a chat with you, you know, a few weeks ago on this, and one other thing that which we haven't mentioned at this moment, but I just remembered, is that obviously at the moment wild camping is technically illegal, and so it is illegal, isn't it? But I mean, obviously
in England and Wales.
In England and Wales,
not Scotland.
No. In Scotland you can, yeah. So if there was to be a permit system, presumably it would have to be made legal first before you could even issue a permit, because you'd be issuing a permit for something that was illegal to do. So that doesn't make sense.
Well, no, because if you are going to have a permit system for anywhere in England, then you'd have to make wild camping legal. But a landowner could set up a scheme,
right, okay,
to allow camping on their land and issue a permit to do it.
Right,
that would be different. You wouldn't need a blanket right for wild camping, because the landowner would be deciding, in that as landowners decide other things can and can't happen on their land. You know? And I can't imagine that there would ever be a national permit system.
No.
Any of the UK countries.
Yeah. And the Labour government did say something before the election that they might try and make wild camping legal in England and Wales. Do you think they will ever do that, or is that just hot air?
They said a number of things, you know, so it wasn't clear what exactly they were going to do, which went from, on the one hand, we'll increase, you know, access rights and camping rights very similar to Scotland, to at the other end, well, we'll improve the access situation a little bit. They'll probably do something in between, but I imagine, you know, they've got enough problems and things they need to deal with. It's not going to be a big...
Yeah, so it's not high on the priority, is it?
So I wouldn't imagine anything much will happen for a few years anyway.
Right.
But because, well, you know, the access situation in England is a mess anyway. It was the best that could be, I think, agreed under the Labour government as it was at the time, but it's still not very, certainly viewing it from Scotland, it's very poor and very confusing.
Right, okay, yeah. So the last bit that I've got on this, and then there's a couple of comments and things we can just have a look at on this, but obviously the biggest problem, and I think the reason why this subject came up in the first place, was probably fly campers, people lighting fires, car campers and things like that, not people that go out in the middle of nowhere and are responsible. So obviously we're not going to get a permit, because clearly it's a ridiculous idea that would never work anyway. but how do we control the current problem? What is there a solution to that?
I can't see an easy one. I mean, one of the things has got to be enforcement of the law as it is now, in that if people are doing damage, that's already illegal. You know, if you go onto someone's land and start cutting down their trees, that is illegal. But you've got to have the enforcement. You've got to have, first of all, you've got to have more rangers to be trying to educate people and tell people what they can do. And you've also got to have legal enforcement, which means you've got to have enough police to deal with this when there's all the other things they have to deal with as well, a lot of which, frankly, are more important. You know, if they're dealing with actual crimes, if they're dealing with violence, if they're dealing, you know, with robbery, those are going to come before dealing with somebody burning a hole in the grass and cutting some branches off a tree. But I think in the popular areas, you do need more rangers. You need more education. I'm sure some of the people who do this simply don't know any better. And I'm afraid some of the encouragement from this, you can see, comes from, if you start looking at some of the bushcraft and survivalist stuff on YouTube, where I'm sure the people behind it don't in any way want to encourage, you know, vandalism or destructive behavior. But you can see people looking at it and thinking, oh, that looks great. We'll go into the woods and light a fire and we'll cut some branches off trees. And they don't really know what they're doing, but they've seen it and it looks impressive, you know, on YouTube. I think that that is a problem.
One comment that's just being put down there: could manage the parking, overnight parking permit maybe, but then you've already got that with some places they charge parking charging anyway. And to be fair, I wouldn't want personally, I wouldn't want any more car parking with charges. Personally,
managing parking is certainly an important tool for managing where people go and when they go, which I think, you know, most local authorities take that into account, and so do landowners of land, certainly land that's popular, because that's been where I am in the Cairngorms. That's been a big issue.
And another comment that someone else said, which is something that I've written down, but about I think it's Richard Jennings. So the reasons are cheap camping gear. I can show that on the screen there. The reasons are cheap camping gear, post-lockdown, and the rises of influences and Insta. Which you mentioned, But if people are going to get cheap camping gear, should they not understand that it is cheap camping gear and that it isn't just going to fall apart in the hills? And how would you educate that?
Well, that is a question of the retailers. Where do you buy the cheap camp gear? But of course, you don't buy it from a reputable outdoor shop where you can get advice from people who know what they're talking about. But I suspect a lot of the people, the problem with cheap camping gear, as I said, is I can see people thinking, well, we'll try camping this weekend, and buying some cheap gear and feeling, oh, that was quite nice. We'll do that again next year. And we'll buy another lot of cheap camping gear because it's so cheap. You know, when you can buy a whole camping kit for less than a night in a hotel, and people don't say, well, I paid for a night in this hotel, so I expect to be able to stay next year and the year after without paying again. People viewing it like that, and that is a problem simply with it being cheap. If you can get your tent and sleeping bag and mat for 50 quid, well, if it falls apart at the end of the weekends, well, it's not really a problem. It was only 50 quid. You can just buy another lot.
Yeah, as you say, so somehow there needs to be more education and things like that. So, I mean,
Yeah. I mean, there's an awful lot around. It's how do you get it to the people who need to see it? That's the thing.
right, yes.
I mean, I say, in Scotland, there's the Scottish Access Code. It's online. It's easy to find. There's all sorts of links to it.
But people just have to read it,
yes, there is
or
still
be bothered to read it. Because obviously, if you're not bothered to read it, well, you
the
just
national
don't care.
parks. Organisations like the Ramblers and Mountaineering Scotland pump out loads of advice on how to camp, leave no trace, etc. So there's tons of information out there.
Yeah.
But you can tell when you look at some of the questions people ask on walking, mountaineering, backpacking sites that they haven't seen any of it, because they're asking really basic questions that it's very easy to find the information on, and these are people who want to learn, aside from people who don't bother looking up anything.
Yeah. And another question down here again, Richard, in the Lake District, would a farmer have the right to stop anyone while camping on their land? I mean, that's basically the same for all of England and Wales, isn't it, really?
Well, if they're the landowner, yes, they would.
Yeah.
I mean, the accepted rule in the Lake District has always been that if you're above the intake walls, then camping is okay. Which always means you're going to have to walk some distance.
Right. Yeah.
But certainly, I say, because wild camping is not a legal right, a farmer can ask someone to leave. But as I understand it, the problem is the farmer can ask you to leave. If you say no, they can go and get a court injunction.
Right.
By which time you've probably left anyway.
Right, because that presumably would take days, if not weeks, to get.
Well, even if it only took a day, if you're there for one night, the farmer turns up again the next afternoon, you're not there. But a farmer can ask you to leave. A farmer can put a sign up saying no camping. They can't physically make you leave if you choose not to.
What would happen if they try to force you to leave? That would assumably be assault or something.
Oh yeah, that's what I mean. They can't use obviously physical force. They can call the police, but the police can only do the same.
Right. So the police couldn't. So could the police move you or unpeg your tent or something? So that even the police couldn't do that.
No, the only way a criminal charge will come into it is if there's been damage, it becomes completely different.
Right.
If because the gate to the field was locked, you'd smashed the lock and broken the gate to get into the field, then the farmer can call the police and have you charged for damaging their property.
Right.
But if the gate can be opened and you just go in and camp in the field and you're not damaging any crops or anything else, all that can happen is they can say, look, can you leave? I don't want you camping here.
Yes. So Richard adds, actually, I can bring this up on the screen so people can see it. Well, the National Trust policy now that rangers are not allowed to approach anyone. This is due to threats of violence during post-lockdown. Rangers just report the issues and then clear up the mess, which kind of brings us back to what you were saying, because if you approach someone and you ask them to leave and they refuse, well, all the ranger or landowner can do realistically is move on, because if they don't, then this could happen.
I haven't heard that. It's certainly not the case in Scotland, where rangers for the National Trust for Scotland, which is a separate organisation to the National Trust in England and Wales. The National Trust for Scotland rangers, I know a couple, and certainly rangers here in Cairngorms National Park, they will approach people regularly and explain, either that they should move, or more often, can they put that fire out? Fires are not allowed here, it's too dangerous. But I've never seen any suggestion in Scotland that rangers shouldn't approach people.
Right. So what would happen if someone is by the roadside or isn't quite far enough? So we've ascertained that we can't force them off because that would be assault. So if they have lit a fire, for example, could a ranger or a policeman or the farmer put the fire out or do something about that? Obviously they can't move the person on.
Well, I think if the fire was seen as doing damage, then that changes the situation. They could put the fire out.
Right.
And they could also say,
you've now caused damage.
You've prosecuted, you've just damaged my land. But
right.
Also, you know, if there is a fire ban in the area, you know, which we've had at times in the Cairngorms and other parts of Scotland in woodland when it's very, very dry, obviously then there's a fire ban.
Right.
That is a bylaw. So if you light a fire, you can be ordered to put it out, or the ranger or the police can put it out for you because you've broken the bylaw.
Right. Okay. So again, then, so if someone is doing some of this chopping trees down and things like that, that now is damaging stuff. So in theory, then they could be moved on because they've done something that they shouldn't. Versus someone like you and I that just puts a tent there.
They could still be asked to move on. I mean, the same thing applies. You know, you can't forcibly move them on. They can be asked to move on, and they can be reported.
Even if they've caused the damage?
Yeah, but they can be reported because they've caused damage, not because they've camped.
Right.
See what I mean? It's the causing damage. It's not the camping. I mean, you know, they could be reported for causing the damage if they weren't camping. If they'd simply decided they were going to have a campfire and they just started chopping down a few trees and lit a big fire. No intention of camping or staying the night. That's irrelevant. It's, you know.
But because they've caused damage, could they not be forcefully moved on because...
No, not forcibly.
No.
Except by the police.
Right. Okay. So just the police could. Yeah. No one else could.
This is why, this goes back to one of the things I was saying earlier, which they did very early on in the States, is why the Rangers are also the police force.
Right. Okay. Right. Yeah.
And so in places like Yosemite and Yellowstone and so on, you don't tend to argue with the Rangers if they ask you to do something anyway, because they're the police and because it's America, they have guns.
Yeah.
They're armed, yeah. So there doesn't tend to be a lot of violence against Rangers in the American parks. To be prepared to say, all the Rangers I've met have been great in America. So
So another question here, or comment here is, but how many people would double down with the police asking you to move on?
I mean, I think the thing here is the chances of the police coming out to ask somebody to move on are remote anyway.
Yes.
You know, unless you're really, really doing a lot of damage, or you or the person doing it has become violent, or there's a fire, which is obviously, you know, setting fire to the local woods. But unless it was something that serious, or you're harming livestock or whatever, the police, as I say, you know, are not going to turn up.
No.
Anyway.
And it's only the police that could move you on, because it's only the police that have the powers, not anyone else. That's correct. I've got that right, haven't I? That's what I was using earlier. What's this other? What does a national park actually do for an area? Is it basically maintain better and has rangers?
That is a complex question, because in the UK, not all national parks are the same, and in Scotland, the two national parks are run completely differently. and they're not the same as any of the national parks in England and Wales.
Right.
UK national parks don't accord to what is generally the accepted international definition of a national park, which does tend to be that it's nationally owned. So the government owns the national park or the vast bulk.
Okay.
That obviously is not the case here. I mean, parks do a whole host of different things, some of which arguably should not be part of the national parks authority anyway. In the Cairngorms, which is the only one I know about in detail because it's where I live, the national park is the planning authority for the area.
Right.
So the national park deals with housing and so on. But there are pluses and minuses. One of the good things I think with the national park, certainly with the Cairngorms, is it's able to have an overall view of the environment of a large area.
Right.
It's not lots of different organisations and landowners, doing bits and pieces here. It can coordinate as far as possible activities, to do with the environment and nature in the area and to do with recreation as well. Rangers, I mean, a lot of the rangers, and again, outside the Cairngorms, I'm not sure, but a lot of the rangers in the Cairngorms are not national park rangers. There are some, but for example, the National Trust for Scotland, which owns a fair chunk of the Cairngorms, has its own rangers. They have the range set. The RSPB, which owns a fair chunk of the Cairngorms as well, has its own rangers. Rothy Mercus Estate, which is private estate but owns a fair bit of the pine woods, they have their own rangers. The rangers coordinate and work together, but there isn't a ranger service for the whole park.
Right. Okay.
And I don't know of any park that does, but I could be wrong, as I say, because there are ones in England and Wales I really don't know that much about.
Right. Okay. I'll ask one more question on this, and then I want to move on to the water because we're coming up to gone 40 minutes. So when we were walking in Scotland, we noticed that there were some areas where they were fenced off, and then so the deer were kept out so that trees could grow and such like. Who sets that up? That's the landowner, not the government or not the rangers telling them to. That's the landowner deciding to do that. Is that right?
Again, it varies. Yes, it's the landowner, but sometimes the landowner is the government because, a lot of forestry is owned by Forest Land and Estates, which used to be the Forestry Commission in Scotland.
Right.
There are government schemes whereby it's a private landowner, but the government are paying for it. The National Trust for Scotland does it. Trees for Life do it. The John Muir Trust does it. So conservation organisations will do it. Private landowners will do it. It varies.
Yeah.
But the fenced areas don't affect access rights. The areas are fenced to keep deer and sheep out.
Yeah.
Not people.
Not people. Yeah. So you can have styles, so you can get in.
You can get in and out of the areas. You can camp in the areas if you want to.
Yeah.
They're accessible. As you know, we walk through some.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. All right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to talking about water. There's a couple of other comments there, but if you've got any other comments, then we'll do another live stream. So ask questions, and next time and everything like that. I just want to change the topic now to water. So let me just do a little bit of background on this. So when I started camping, when I started walking on Dartmoor 20 odd years ago, I started filtering the water because obviously that's what I'd heard from school. I had heard various other places, so I had one of those MSR pump filter things. So I started off with one of those, which took me like 20 years and was a bit of a, it's very good. MSR make good stuff, but it was a bit of a nightmare to use. So I started with one of those. Then I heard about Aquamira, and I started off using Aquamira drops because it was like very, very light to use. Then after a little bit of time, everybody should pick up one of these, read about water and such like in there, which we're going to discuss. And basically, I'd also read somewhere else that, so don't quote us on this or anything like, if you all die, don't blame me or Chris or anything like that. But I'd read somewhere, and it wasn't Chris, that with Aquamira, they say 7 drops of one, 7 drops of the other per litre. And the reason why they say 7 drops is basically because that's a lawyer telling them to say 7 drops so that they can't get into trouble. So I then started thinking, okay, well, maybe let's just do 4 drops and see whether I die. And I didn't. And another thing that I noticed that I was doing when I was camping is I was never letting the water boil. And of course, I'd always heard that when you boil water, you know, it kills all the bugs and everything else like that. Yeah. But to save fuel, basically, I just didn't boil it completely. I made it hot enough that it was hot enough for tea. And once again, I never dropped dead from doing that. And I kind of then started to think, between my actions and reading what you had written in that book about water, I then just haven't treated the water above human habitation on Dartmoor at all. Even though there are livestock there, I haven't treated water on Dartmoor for 12 years. I went to the Peak District, and I'll admit the first time that I went, I took a filter because I was thinking it's a popular area, and I just looked around me, used my judgment, and I have not yet even filtered the water in the Peak District. I haven't filtered it in Wales, and I certainly haven't done any treatment when I've been up in Scotland with you. So basically, for the last 12 years, above human habitation, anything where there is livable things. Maybe if I was in the Lake District, maybe below Angel Tarn or something like that, there's a very popular tarn. Maybe I would, but to be honest, I'm not even convinced that personally I would there because of the volume of water and the volume of peat and moss and bogs around and everything. So I'm still not convinced I would there. So that's my story about why I don't, just as background. So I've got a few things written down, so we'll let Chris speak now properly. So when did water treating become a thing? That's probably the first thing.
It started in the UK in, I think, the late 1980s, and then gradually increased in the 90s. I mean, I had done masses of backpacking in the UK. I'd walked from Land's End to John O'Groats. I'd done the Pennine Way. I'd done all the Munros in the Scottish Highlands without ever once reading or hearing any suggestion that you couldn't just drink the water. And I went to the USA in 1982 to do the Pacific Crest Trail, and it was much the same. I went to the USA in 1985 to do the Continental Divide Trail, and suddenly people were talking about, oh, you can't drink the water.
Right.
And that's when it seemed to begin in the States. Then it took time to come over here. And because you rapidly got manufacturers joining in, hey, we can sell something, we can make filters, we can sell chlorine tablets and all the rest of it. And advertising, which you used to get in the outdoor magazines, that, you have to treat your water. And it became, certainly by 2000, it had become like almost everyone knows the water isn't safe to drink. But when I was doing, the Backpacker's Handbook that you held up earlier, well, the very first edition of that was a UK publisher. It was then sold to an American publisher because I pointed out that, a lot of it was actually about my experiences in America, and that, whilst it would be very useful for someone doing the Pennine Way, they didn't really need to know about how to protect their food from bears. So the American publishers came back to me and said, "Oh, you haven't got a section on filters and how to treat your water. You've got to do something about that." I did an awful lot of research, which I reference in the book, but an awful lot of research to find out, what is the position? And came back to them and said, "Look, this is what I've now written. No, I don't need to say any more than I've said," which wasn't never treat water, but which was think about where you are and what you're doing. As you said, habitation, or incredibly popular camping sites, bothies. I mean, in the Scottish Highlands, I would always take water upstream of a bothy just to be careful, because you don't know how clean or not people have been in and around somewhere where there's people every night. In the Lake District, Styhead Tarn, I take water running into the tarn, not the water running out, because it's such a popular camping area. But other than that, I don't treat the water here. On some of the long walks in the USA, where I've been going through low-level cattle country and taking water out of, cattle tanks with green scum on top, I've treated the water, oddly enough. But, it's not a critical thing. If you don't feel secure without treating all your water, then treat it. There's nothing, no reason not to, if that makes you feel more comfortable, as long as, and I'll tell you a little anecdote from the Continental Divide Trail, as long as you do drink enough water. When I was doing the Continental Divide Trail, I met this group fairly early on called the Connecticut Continental Divide Trail Expedition, which was a group with a support van who were doing the trail, but their members changed as they went along, but they coincided with me for a couple of nights, and I got chatting to some of them. And then about 3 weeks later, I was in this town. It was a town stop. I was having a day off. I met one of them walking down the high street towards me, except they looked about 100 years older and really ill. And I was like, what has happened to you? A lot of the section to there was high level. There weren't many water spots. They had been airlifted out of the mountains suffering from severe dehydration because they said it took too long to pump enough water to drink at each of these few streams, and they couldn't carry enough, but they didn't dare drink the water without filtering it. So they ended up collapsing. So as I say, if it's a choice, drink the water. You don't want to get severe dehydration. Not that in the UK that is often a likely problem. Certainly hasn't been in Scotland this summer anyway.
Yeah, it's quite wet down here. So that's when did it start? What have you noticed? So what have you noticed over the years? So what changes have you noticed? So obviously it started in like the 80s and 90s.
Well,
so
I just noticed
what has happened?
An increasing amount of advice that you should always treat the water. So in some places it becomes like received wisdom, standard, and the idea without any evidence that the water isn't safe to drink. But I've never seen a scientific study of water, up in the Scottish mountains to say this has got all these bugs in. And if you remember from my book, one of the bits of research I did in the States, where the main concern is this nasty little bug called Giardia, was they actually found more Giardia cysts in the public water supply in San Francisco than in streams in the Sierra Nevada.
Right.
Nobody was advising people in San Francisco that they should treat the tap water, but everybody going into the Sierra Nevada was advised they needed to treat the water.
Right. Yeah. And do you think there are, okay, so are there viruses in the water? Because I've heard that there are viruses in the water and they're very dangerous.
No, well, they are very dangerous. In the UK, viruses in water are not a problem. Now, one place I've been where viruses are a problem, and then, you know, and they can kill you, where all the water I drank was treated, is the Himalaya.
Right.
Which is very different. You also got to allow that most filters will not remove viruses anyway, because most filters that are designed for use in Europe or in North America are for use where there aren't problems with viruses. So they're to filter out bacteria and amoeba, which are a lot bigger than viruses.
Right. Yeah.
Filter viruses are, you know, really, really tiny. So you need a very, very, very fine filter, which means it takes an awful lot longer to pump water.
Yeah.
I mean, on the Nepal treks I did, you just use iodine. You know, the Sherpas and these were all treks, you know, I was leading, so they were all organized.
Yeah.
But there were only two ways of treating the water: iodine and boiling.
Right. Okay.
Nobody bothered with filters.
Right. Okay.
It was just going to take too long, you know, and they clog up all the time. But yeah, so no, you certainly don't need to bother about the viruses.
Right. And is there a chance of Giardia in water in the hills, and where would it come from if it was there?
I don't think from what I've read, there isn't much chance at all. Again, in the UK, doesn't mean to say it's not possible. There are other things though that are thoroughly nasty that you could get in water.
Cryptosporidium, isn't there?
And you know, others as well. There was an assumption which seems to have died at the moment. There was an assumption for a while, because Giardia was always in the news, that anyone who got a stomach bug in the hills had Giardia.
Right.
But you only know it's Giardia if it's been confirmed because you've been to the doctor and they've taken a stool sample and said, yes, it's Giardia. Otherwise, you don't know. Might be. But
right. Yeah.
You know, I mean, I should add that I have had extremely appalling stomach ailments in the mountains 3 times. Every single time was in Nepal, despite taking all the precautions and only having to drink water, but I still managed to get ill. So it's not like I'm immune to stomach bugs, therefore I can drink the water, which people have.
Because I mean, I've heard people say to me, "Oh, you must be immune to it, or because you always drink it." I don't see that.
Sadly, I know to my cost, I'm not.
No,
really, I'm not.
No. So the next one we've kind of answered. Why don't you filter it? Because obviously it doesn't need doing. Do you get much kickback from saying that you don't filter your water? Do people complain to you and say, "Oh, you're talking nonsense," or you shouldn't be advising that? Or
I haven't recently. There was never that much. There was a little bit, but probably 15, 20 years ago, not much. One of the things I would like to say though is one of the reasons I don't like treating water is because I enjoy dipping a water bottle into a cold, refreshing stream and drinking, and not having to wait for however long the chemicals take, and then the water tastes a bit off anyway, or having to get a filter out and play with, just the sheer pleasure of just drinking the water. And that to me is important. And the other one is not having to carry lots of water, because I will drink out of the next stream I come to. I'm not thinking, oh, well, if I manage to filter 3 liters now, then I won't have to stop again.
Right. Okay. Well, CH has put up a comment, which is kind of something else that I was going to come on to. Giardia would come from mammal feces or human contact.
That's a very good point. When I was reading all the studies for the Backpacker's Handbook, one of the things that came up was that most cases of Giardia that they had records for were from what they described as oral fecal contact, not from water. And one of the suggestions, was if you're really concerned, don't worry about the water. But if someone offers you a bag of trail mix, don't take it. Who else's fingers have been in that trail mix? Where else have those fingers been? How clean are the people? They said, no, don't share things like that.
Because I mean, that is one of my number one. That's probably one of my number one rules. If I'm with someone else and they offer me something, they probably think, "Oh, well, why didn't he want my whatever?" And I never. I mean,
obviously it depends what it is. If they offer you a wrapped chocolate bar, that's fine.
No, yeah,
you're going to unwrap it. If, however, they've got a chocolate bar in their hands and they hand it to you, say, "Do you want a bite?" Then I would think, "No, thanks."
Right. Yeah.
I'm not that fussy about it, but that is one of the things that if you're really concerned about water, you need to be even more concerned about sharing food and utensils, passing a mug round for everyone to have a swig out of, or a water bottle. Again, how clean are the hands of the people who've been handling it before you? How clean are your hands?
Right. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. So with mammal feces, so this kind of this also could that introduce something into the water? Let's start with that.
Depends on the mammal. Certainly, I would be wary of drinking water if there were cows upstream, because apart from anything else, cows are one of, I think, the few, certainly domestic mammals that will stand in the water and crap. They're not bothered, It's possible. I haven't drunk water from a place like that to find out.
Right. Okay. Well, one thing.
Sheep, doesn't bother me. Deer don't bother me.
Okay. Yeah. So So because another thing that I often hear people saying, well, I've heard a few people say that the water is, if you pardon my French, that the water is full of shit and piss because there are cows and sheep and deer and things like that. But I mean, I never. To me, the water is fine, and I never see it as being of such constituency, if that's the right word. But that seems to be the mind process that some people have.
Yeah, and as I say, if it's going to worry you, then treat the water. There's no point thinking, no, people have said water's okay to drink, I'm going to make myself drink it. If you're then going to feel unhappy.
Yeah. So I mean, clearly better to treat it if you're not sure.
Thing. Yeah. If you're not sure, if it makes you feel more comfortable, then treat the water. Yeah, it's not a either or.
Yeah. So
I mean, another study I remember now. This is going back, so I don't know what the position is now, but I noticed someone has talked about hikers on the AT in the comments. CH.
Right. Yeah.
That the study I read, someone did a review of hikers on the AT, ones who just drank the water, ones who treated the water some of the time, and some who absolutely filtered and treated all the water before they drank it. So you've got three groups. Roughly 30% of each group came down with stomach upsets.
Right.
So the same number of people who didn't treat the water at all came down with stomach upsets as the number of people who treated all the water. And 30%, yeah, that's a high number. But again, how much of that was because of the communal atmosphere of sharing on the AT rather than because of the water?
Right.
You
Yeah.
know,
And the one thing that I wanted us to add about cows particularly, I think I remember mentioning this to you specifically, Chris, but I not just generally. I remember, oh, it was probably 10 years ago. It might even have been when Bess was around. I can't remember, but it's certainly going back. I know, I think it was just after, it was in between. I think Bess was around, but maybe I wasn't walking with her. And I remember heading for a stream on Dartmoor. And then when I got there, I noticed that and it was a small stream. It was not a big stream either. And there was a whole load of cows at the top of it. And I must admit, for a moment or two, I kind of worried, and I thought, well, everyone's always said that you know cows and da 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 da. And I thought, well, the cows are up there, and I'm down here, at least 1, 2, if not 300 meters away, and I just sort of sod it. I'm just going to take the water anyway, and I didn't have a problem from that. Admittedly, I was in camp, so probably most of the water I was heating to a degree, but I mean, I certainly didn't have a problem with that. And this was something that we had a conversation with in Scotland. Another thing that I often hear, and I think you've heard as well, is that people say there might be a dead animal in the water, and then they worry from
yes.
that. And what I mentioned, and I think you agreed with you, but I won't put words in your mouth here as we're on a public thing. But what I said is if there was a dead animal in the water, I'm either going to see it, and therefore I'm going to go above it. But if I can't see it, it's probably far enough up that by the time the water has got to me, it's probably you know, the concentration of dead animal to water is probably so small as to be insignificant. So that's kind of my answer to that.
I would think yes, yeah.
So yeah.
And of course, the other thing always with water is if the water is clear and doesn't smell, then it's probably fine. Obviously, if water looks stagnant, you know, and if there's a smell that you're not quite comfortable with, then treat the water.
Yes. Yeah. So obviously people, you know, do carry. I know I take the mickey in my videos a bit sometimes, but obviously treat your water. We're not saying don't treat your water, you know, but it's just another side of the story that, you know, I think just as everybody is now so thing on that you have to treat the water, and it's just one of those things that
I'll say, and if you think that, really do think about sharing any food or utensils, you know, because that is more likely to make you ill than the water.
Right. Yeah. So don't share utensils, don't share bottles, don't put your hands in other people's trail mixes. You know, if someone else has cooked something and they offer you some food, then obviously make sure that your knife and fork is clean before you start sticking it into their food and Vicky Verky and that type of thing. So basic things like that. I think there's a couple of comments which we'll come back to. We've probably kind of answered this one anyway, but what do you say to people who have criticized you? This is me asking you a question. What do you say to people who criticize you or say that you should be treating the water because everybody else does?
Well, I say that I'm not going to be dishonest about my experiences. I'm going, you know, I write from what I do. So I'm going to tell people what I do. And I'm not saying you mustn't treat the water. You know, that would be irresponsible. Yeah. I'm saying this is what I do. This is why. Here's the evidence I've used to say this is okay. here's the options for treating water. If you want to do so, it's up to you. But it's the same thing as, I mean, far more common than water with criticisms that I get is I'm criticized regularly still for recommending hiking in trail shoes by people who say you can hike in trail shoes if you want, but you've got to advise everyone else to wear boots. And I think, well, I don't wear boots in the summer. Why should I be advising other people? And the other one at the other end of the seasons is ice axes. You know, because I recommend what these days is regarded as relatively long ice axe, because that's what I learnt with. I'm told, no, that's wrong. Long ice axes are dangerous. You've got to recommend 50 centimetre ice axes, 55 at most. And I say, well, I don't use those. I don't even own an ice axe that short.
Right.
But it's always the thing of, I never want to look like I'm in any way trying to lay down the law or tell people what to do other than when it's leave no trace, going back to wild camping, which is different.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say, if you're happy in boots, well, fine, wear boots. If you prefer a short ice axe, use a short ice axe. If you want to treat your water, treat your water. Yeah. What I'm giving is what I do, why I do it, what the other options are, and then it's up to people to work out what works best for them.
Right. Yeah. Okay, let's come to it. There's a question here. I'll bring this one up here. So I'm not sure what that first word is. Sorry, but was the one that got me freaked out?
That's a disease.
Right. Okay.
I don't think it's one that I believe can be spread by rats. I think if you're drinking from reservoirs and lakes in lowland England, then that's something to worry about. I don't think if you're up in the hills drinking from tarns and pools, it is something to worry about. I don't know much about Weil's disease. I'm not sure that if the water is running, it's therefore generally okay. If it's in an area where that's a problem anyway.
Right. But that type of area that you're talking about, that when you say lowland anyway, that's going to be around human habitation anyway.
Well, there are areas where I would be treating water.
Where we would be treating it anyway. Yeah. What we're talking about is above human habitation. So obviously if you're in an area, even if there are houses below you, but there is a farm, a busy farm, just to cover myself. If there's a farm above you or something like that, then I would then be treating the water.
And I mean, if you've got,
because people are up there.
Yeah, and if you've got farms above you, as well as obviously the animals, you're also got chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, who knows what has washed into the water. So if there's a farm, I want to be upstream of it.
Right. Yes. Yeah. But generally, to answer the question, if you're high up and the water is running, then it's fine. Yeah. I mean, I've taken water from tarns, which isn't running, and that's all. I think also fine. Again, because you're high up, that's just something. Yes. So the next one down is, I've got to head out, but we'll listen to the rest when I get back. Thanks for the discussion. Would love to hear Chris's thoughts on limes and the trajectory over the next 5 years in the UK. That's obviously to do with ticks. Can you answer that one?
Briefly? I mean, I am not an expert or very knowledgeable on this, but I think there's two factors. One is there is definitely an increase in the number of ticks. I mean, there is in our garden, but so there are more ticks, more people are getting tick bites. The other thing seems to be that limes is much better recognized now. I mean, it's not that many years ago when people were saying, the doctor didn't realize what it is. they wouldn't accept when I said I thought it was from a tick bite, whereas now it's become recognised. So I would imagine more cases are being correctly identified now than were in the past. But the chances are that because there are more ticks, there are going to be more cases anyway. But what the trajectory is, other than, yes, ticks are increasing, recognition of Lyme is increasing, but what the trajectory is, I have no idea. No. You would need to look at, a scientist who studies this to come up with figures.
Yeah. Do you think that some people are more prone to ticks than others? Because I've been camping for dozens, 20 years. I've been on Dartmoor 20 years and camping 12 odd years, and I've removed one tick from me in that time, and it hadn't even dug its. I have seen a couple walking on me, and I've seen a couple trundling around on my sleeping bag, but I haven't seen any on me.
I know this from here, in that so far that I've noticed, I have picked up 2 ticks locally in the house and removed them. My partner can go out and wander around the garden for half an hour and come in and find 3 ticks.
Oh, right.
We've found so many ticks this year, and we're going in the same places, we're walking in the same places. It's not,
right.
I'm picking up very few. She's picking up lots. So
right.
But it's the same with other insects. Midges will bite me, but they're nothing like as bad for me as other people. But also, midges bite me. It's annoying at the time. Itches like mad. Half an hour later, it's gone. Forget about it. Again, my partner, midges bite her, and she's scratching 2 days later and cursing me. So she's a lot more paranoid about midges than I am, but I understand why.
Yes.
So again, I don't know why this is, but
seems to be. And then the next question is, so yes, my comment about the AT was about the social aspect of the AT and sharing everything. So you answered that, because to be honest, even I was thinking he was talking about water, and you understood, as usual, you understood.
I guess when he said norovirus, I thought he was talking, because the thing with the Appalachian Trail is, first of all, it's incredibly popular. So you're talking about, hundreds and hundreds of people, thousands every year. But also there are shelters along the way, often lean-to type shelters, where everybody stays in. So people are staying in the same places every night. So obviously it's a very communal experience, if you want it to be. So people are sharing lots of food, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So it's very easy for disease to spread amongst them.
Yeah. And then probably from that, I think people's mindset seems to be to blame the water rather than to, because they just seem to blame the water just all the time. Is what okay. Then the next one here, I read that there's a certain type of bacteria found in some water sources, that when you boil that water, the toxin that is released by the bacteria is more deadly than the bacteria itself.
I have never heard that.
No.
I have no idea about that at all. But I'm sure if it was much of a problem, I would have come across it.
Yes, yeah. I've
heard boil water, it kills everything. So that, I often think with backpacking that if I haven't got any water purification with me, well, I have actually, because I've got a stove. So if I end up with water that I think I really don't like the look of this water, okay, I'll have to use up a bit more fuel, but I can boil it.
Right. Yeah. So if you were out and about and there was no streams or anything like that, and you found a puddle, now clearly a puddle isn't moving water. So even I would be filtering or boiling puddle water. But if you were taking water from a puddle, would you be trying to put it through a sock or put it through your t-shirt or something first?
Well, if if it was, if it had got sediment in it, yes. But I mean, I've sometimes in the Cairngorms, I mean, up on the Moyne Moor, I've camped where there's a puddle, if you like, or a small depression with water in it, and that's been my water source, and I've just drunk it.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Perfectly clear. There's not a lot of it, but yeah, as I say, you do look at the water and see what it looks like.
Yeah, but again, I think up there, if it's in the middle of nowhere, then yes,
yeah.
I think I would.
I mean, I've never done it in the UK, but on one of the walks in America, I remember someone suggested this, and it turned out to be a really good idea. They said the water will probably be okay, but some of it will be quite dirty. So take coffee filters and filter the water through the coffee filter.
Right. Okay.
Just to get the sediment out of it.
Yeah. If we got any more questions, just whip them down quickly, because we're coming near the end of the questions. We've got one more which we'll just look at, and we will finish in a minute anyway. So just to let people know. So I'm not sure what this one is here. We used to have to be careful when getting game bird feed from farmers with Weil's disease. They can be very serious.
Oh, I know it can be a serious disease, yes, but
I've never heard of it. What is this anyway? I've never even heard of it.
Oh, I have, because there's been outbreaks again in southern England around reservoirs and things. Swimmers have got it.
Is it a virus or is it a bacteria?
I honestly don't know. No. I'd have to look it up. I've never actually been anywhere where it's a potential problem.
Right.
I've just read about it in news stories. That's all.
Yeah. Okay. All right. If there's any questions, rat toilet.
Yeah.
All right, if there's any questions, whip them down quickly below, because I think I've run out of things here. Is there anything that you would just wanted to say, Chris, rather than me just asking questions? Is there anything you wanted to say or ask? Or
I agree. The comment that's just come in about, it used to be thought that 73 Celsius, enough bacteria killed to consider meat safe. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've read is everything is dead before the water boils. But unless you're carrying an accurate thermometer to measure the temperature of the water,
right, okay,
it's best to let it boil, then everything's safe. I mean, this is where, Tony, when you were saying that, you didn't let the water boil, just get very hot, you were probably letting it get hot enough anyway to kill everything.
Yes.
But obviously, on a food hygiene place, you can measure the temperature. You can know when water reaches 73. When you're boiling the water in a little pot in your tent in the hills, you probably haven't got a way of telling when you reach.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, I've heard you don't actually have to boil the water fully, but you've passed the point at which everything's dead.
Yeah.
When the water boils.
Yeah. I think one thing we just ought to say, I will just ask you, because obviously some people will want to filter and treat their water. What options are there, Chris? Just so that, so people, so they can't see that we haven't given any information on what to do if they wish to.
If you're doing a lot of water for a group, then there are the filters, where you hang a large bag and use gravity into a bottle. They're a bit big and heavy for one person and unnecessary. There's still Aquamira around. There are chlorine tablets. I think if you don't think you'll need to treat water, but you want to have an emergency backup, then Aquamira or chlorine tablets, because they're tiny and very small and light, you can shove them in your first aid kit and forget about them. I'd only carry an actual filter if I thought I was going to use it, a pump filter. But these days as well, you can get water bottles with a filter that screws on the top, squeezy bottle, and then you can squeeze them, drink straight from the bottle. There's a lot of options.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I think that's probably just to remind everyone, check out, where's the camera?
Thank you, Tony.
Check out Chris's book. Make sure or any of the other books that Chris has written. He's written many. So, check out those. All right. I think we've finished. There's no more questions or anything. So I'll let Chris say thank you first.
Okay, thank you, Tony. It's been
So,
interesting.
yeah, thank you very much. So I'll turn off the live stream. We will still be here, so we can say toodaloo ourselves, right? That's great. Thanks very much indeed, everybody, and hopefully we'll get Chris back again sometime, and
Yes,
we'll see
I'd
you
like
again.
to. Okay,
Thank you very
goodbye.
much. Bye bye, everybody.